We are now entering the area of proper panel discussion, but this time I'm not going to be alone on stage. I'm going to have Klaus Mielke, and the nice thing is we've created a new technical term that never existed before in television language. You're my sidekick. Grand, wonderful. So Klaus, very happy that you're going to be co-creating questions, that you're going to get involved, and maybe on the verge of introducing the panel. Let's just have one quick remark. This is the second year that we are addressing, and actually I remember we had Shifting the Trillions, again, exactly this title last year. What has changed from your perspective?
Well, there was some movement, and we heard something about this also from John Kerry, that the US did a little bit more, and I say underlined a little bit. It's not enough. Climate finance is crucial, absolutely crucial, and this question is so important that it somehow is a shadow over Glasgow, because the developing countries, the old developing countries, as I may say, they are absolutely looking to the industrialized world, how much you will give for climate finance. And we decided to bring up 100 billion per year for mitigation and adaptation. That's in the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's absolutely not enough. And I think we will hear more about from our experts now, how it can move into this direction, what is necessary, the special drawing rights from IMF and others. But I think this question has to be solved in a very short time.
It will hopefully be so, because some of our panelists that we now announce are the ones that are moving forward fast, and maybe already have the new thinking that we heard Michael O'Leary say we need on all sides. Now, we have a slight change of plan. The good thing is, ladies and gentlemen, you're sitting here, you don't actually have the detailed plan, so you wouldn't know about that, but everybody who was online might have known. One of our panelists, Fiona Reynolds, can't be with us. She has unfortunately been ill, and the principles for responsible investment are a very important bit and parcel of the show that we're going to have now. But now we have a lineup of a number of gentlemen and one lady. So let me say hello to Kallhauge Kochwieser, to Vinay, Shandal, to Bruce Lourie, who is actually here live and in color. Angela Churie Kallhauge is probably already in Washington. She's up, and Michael Northrop of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund is already up and with us. Now, as we have just said, Fiona isn't with us, but Kallhauge Kochwieser could, let's say, change the direction of the first input, and he's going to give us an overview of where we are standing right at the moment. At the moment, the feather to his hat is the European Climate Fund, the chair of the advisory board. But you, Kallhauge, have a long history, starting off with the World Bank, being state secretary in Germany with the finance ministry, and then long years with the Deutsche Bank. So, Kallhauge, where are we right at the moment with responsible investment?
Thank you very much, and let me start by congratulating the organizers, you all, for putting together this very timely, important conference. In my remarks on shifting the trillions financing the green and just transition, I will try, from my perspective as a former policymaker as well as banker, first to assess the remarkable progress that has been made in recent past. Second, highlight where the international community has badly failed in scale and speed of action. And three, propose then a few key priorities for the G20 deliberations, Glasgow COP and beyond in order to indeed trigger the shifting of trillions. First, on the progress. Over the past few years, the broad and reinforced commitment of governments and the international community to carbon neutrality by mid-century has led to a profound shift, I believe, in the global narrative and discourse. Expectations and risk perceptions in the private sector, decisive action even by courts, and shareholder activism and civil society pressures. While the path towards net zero are still very ill-defined, the direction of travel is clear. Most investors and companies ceased hedging.
And there we see the internet isn't working. Now we're not quite sure on which side that is the case. Kallhauge, can you please repeat the last minute or roundabout because the screen was slightly stopped?
Oh, I don't know where I should. Well, I made the point that over the past year, the broad and reinforced commitment of governments and the international community to carbon neutrality by mid-century has indeed had as a result, a profound shift in the global narrative and discourse, expectations and risk perceptions in the private sector, decisive action even by courts, and shareholder activism and civil society pressures. While the path towards these net zero are still very ill-defined, the direction of travel is now clear. Most investors and companies cease to hedge for alternative longer-term policy outcomes. The big transformation has begun. Impressive examples are the European Green Deal and EU taxonomy, and what is to be classified as green and brown in that. The multilateral development banks mobilizing their vast balance sheets, the IMF and central banks moving the link between sustainability, climate risks, and financial stability center stage, asset managers and banks applying ESG criteria, responding to client demand, carbon risk disclosure and corporate balance sheets moving gradually from voluntary towards mandatory, various oil majors, we heard about Shell, beginning to change their business models towards a long-term carbon neutrality, to mention just a few. Most impressive are, in my mind, the political impact of citizens' campaigns like Fridays for Future and the objective of a decarbonized future becoming central part of the program of a broad spectrum now of political parties, as evidenced most recently by the German elections. So much for the good news and achievements. The direction of travel towards a decarbonized future is widely accepted and clear. Where have we failed? Where the international community is badly failing, and that brings me to my second point, is in the scale and speed of action, of policy adjustment and triggering the flow of the required amounts of financial resources in the new direction. The latest IPCC code red warning and the submitted NDCs show we are far off track, as we all know, looking at a rise in emissions by 2030 since 2010 and 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming. The Paris 1.5 target is only feasible if the G20 step up. A number of G20 countries are clearly not fully committed here. The gaps between climate finance pledges and the 100 billion annual target established long ago remain stark. Despite recent additional pledges we heard from John Kerry, and I could continue the list. We are failing on scale and speed of redirecting financial flows. I might add here, we have also failed badly on introducing credible carbon pricing systems, and I will come back to that. We are at what are then the top priorities pre and post Glasgow COP for financing the transition? Let me propose four for G20 governments to focus on. The Glasgow COP to agree, and the global financial sector pursue in order to really scale and accelerate the shifting of trillions. First, as part of a reinvigorated Glasgow package, the agreement on solidarity packages, I would call them, on climate finance to reach and surpass the 100 billion a year goal, with issues of access and quality addressed, and the agreement now to open negotiations on the post-2025 finance goals. The 100 billion annually or 500 billion until 2025, if we reach them, are only small, a minimum compared to what will have to be done for the developing countries. The reinvigorated package should also contain the long-delayed agreement on operationalizing market mechanism under Article 6. Second priority, for the Board of Governors of the IMF to reach consensus and individual developed country members to decide the reallocation of the very large part of the recent 650 billion SDR allocation by the IMF to climate finance in developing countries. A number of members, and particularly their central banks, are still conservative and reluctant. For example, also Germany. Third, the G20 should, and Glasgow COP should support to provide more forceful leadership on carbon pricing, using carbon taxes or emission trading systems, based on the experience now with dozens of regional and sectoral pilot schemes. The EU and China are moving and could lead, hopefully overcoming the US domestic reluctance, which is really standing in the way big time. These carbon prices will have to be strong, rising, and credible, no reversals, and would eventually lead to move trillions, I believe, if done well. For ensuring a level playing field internationally, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, as developed and debated by the EU and considered by a few other G20 governments now, should be promoted by the G20. While technically and politically complex, also regarding WTO conformity, I believe these obstacles can be overcome, and they will be key to avoid, carbon leakage and provide incentives for others to follow. Fourth, based on the path-breaking work on voluntary carbon risk disclosure in corporate balance sheets by the Financial Stability Board and G20 finance ministers and central bankers in cooperation with the private financial sector, the G20 should now move towards making risk disclosure mandatory. A number of members, including France and Brazil and their others, have moved in this direction. To sum up, ensuring financial support to the developing countries by reaching and exceeding the 100 billion, SDR reallocations, expanded use of MDB balance sheets, joint action on forceful carbon prices with social compensation for low-income households and border adjustments, and making carbon risk disclosure in companies and banks mandatory, the G20 would indeed contribute decisively to scaling and accelerating climate action, and eventually to shifting trillions of investments towards carbon neutrality in 2050. I wish the F20 continued success in persuading their governments and citizens. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Kayo, and again, applause from the audience here. We're not quite sure how the audience out there would react, simply because today we're, of course, in this conundrum that we're taping everything, and that response will come at a later point. So, ladies and gentlemen, should you be seeing this, should you be watching this, don't hesitate to send emails, to text, to Twitter, whatever you want. And I think right at at the moment we leave the eagle's view and now go into the issues at hand. And ladies and gentlemen, all I can say is I'm so much looking forward to our next speaker. You can't believe it. So if you're sort of sitting there relatively relaxed, sit up straight, put on your safety belt, because Vinay Shandal is going to take you along. If you have only glimpsed 2 minutes of the TED Talk he gave on conscious investing, you would know what I'd be talking about, but you're not going to, you're now actually going to see him, and you're going to see him act and sort of put out his magic. Because the big question, Vinay, is you're actually, just let me share that with the audience, you're actually leading the Boston Consulting Group's principal investment and private equity practice in Canada. You're engaged in a number of other issues, for example, the Center for Canada's Future, so at the top of discussion. And we've just heard from Howard that multilateral development banks and their investments, all the funds that are out there, private equity, private capital is actually sort of, well, if it's a third, it's a lot. Now, we've also heard from John Kerry the word pledges. But if I understand your business correctly, business of investing is a business, so you also want to make money. How do you combine both doing good and making money?
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, when you set up that intro, I wasn't sure which speaker you were referencing. I was getting excited to see who it was. Thanks for that very warm introduction, and obviously to all my co-panelists and speakers today. So look, on the topic of doing well and doing good, I think this is an argument that many of us in the field have had for years with investors, with management teams, and others. The good news is that the data in support of the correlation and the causation of stronger, use the word loosely, ESG performance and financial performance is just becoming increasingly apparent. So I think this belief that you have to create a trade-off between improved performance of my asset from a climate or broader ESG standpoint and financial returns, I think is beginning to go away, and that people see the two as very much correlated. In fact, if you think of private equity and value creation in private equity, I think there's been 4 eras. PE 1.0 was leverage, right? PE 2.0 was operational value creation. 3.0 was digital acceleration. I believe 4.0 is going to be sustainability improvement, and that's why I think the work that my friend Michael at Engine Number One is doing is so forward-looking, right? This thesis that engaging with companies to improve their sustainability performance as a basis for prosecuting change is just, I think brilliant. And unfortunately, there's not enough Michael O'Leary's and Engine Number Ones out there. And I think that is the direction in which capital needs to move. I think at a higher level, what's actually encouraging, I think it's easy to get discouraged when we talk about climate. I think what's encouraging is if you look at companies and you look at the emissions start with old world companies and the emissions they produce, there's a lot of belief that, okay, net zero 2050, gosh, we've got to wait a long time before we start taking emissions out because we got to wait for the maturation of technologies to come in place. We have to wait for carbon pricing. I think the first 40% of emissions can be taken out today. And this is why I believe that investors that are divesting are missing the point, because I've said in the talk you referenced at the top, you can divest your way to a greener portfolio, absolutely. You can't divest your way to a greener world. And the good news is our studies have shown that the first 40% of emissions reduction in most sectors can be achieved in many cases in a way that is ROI positive, just on a cost savings basis, or at most cost $10 per ton. The next 40%, and this is where the carbon pricing becomes very important, requires a cost of $10 to $100. And the last 20% is going to require new technologies that have not yet matured, which will require we can't wait till market forces to let those technologies mature will be here until 2040, 2050, 2060. We need catalytic capital. We need blended finance for that last 20% to bring more capital to them. But the irony is that we can have a world that is 40% less emittive if investors and management teams work together. And 40% is a big deal. If you ask yourself, how much did emissions go down during the pandemic when we all stopped flying and traveling and driving? It was only 5%, right? And so think about what a meaningful delta 40% actually represents. What a fundamental change to how we do business, how we make products, how we render services would be. So that's sort of on the side of companies. On the side of capital, you know, I think that if you look at the amount, that last 20%, the amount of money we need to finance transition, to finance the climate transition. We did a study with the GFMA. The number we came up with, and you're going to laugh because it's a massive range, but it's $100 to $150 trillion. It's a massive range because as consultants, we did it bottoms up, sector by sector, a bunch of assumptions around technology, business model innovation, taking effect, et cetera. But 100 to 150 trillion. The current flow of capital going into climate transition, if you annualize that, is a sixth of it. So it's about 600 billion versus the 2 to 3 that you need per year through to 2050. So there's a major gap. And then if you double click into private investment, everyone talks about, oh, everybody's got a climate fund. Every day I open the newspaper, there's a new fund raising money focused on climate. But again, there's about an 8x gap between the amount of private capital we need going into this space versus elsewhere. And so I think the issue and the reason for that, in our view, is a lot of the capital is going into established mature technologies, right? Renewables, like solar, wind, batteries, electric vehicles, sort of business models that are proven with low risk. But there's a whole host of technologies for that last 20%: fuel cells, hydrogen, grid modernization, that may not be immediately ROI positive based on pure market forces. Where I think catalytical capital, blended finance arrangements are going to be the critical unlock, so that capital-seeking market returns can actually flood the zone and begin to advance those technologies. And maybe the last point I'll say, then I'll hand it over to others who I'm sure have much more to add on this topic. Is subsidies, right? And I think we often think about subsidies as we need to subsidize the new technology, but we also have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. There's currently, if you sum up all the direct and indirect subsidies for fossil fuels, about 5 trillion. And that doesn't account for the negative externalities of carbon, which you hit through a carbon price. So it's not that the technologies, the technologies are basically competing on a less than level playing field. Yes, they require subsidization and support, absolutely, but the path to them becoming competitive in a market is handicapped by virtue of the subsidies going to fossil fuels and the lack of carbon pricing. So I very much echo the views on carbon. And maybe the last thing I'll say on carbon pricing is people say, oh, well, a lot of countries have a price on carbon. Yeah, but only six countries have a price on carbon that's more than 40. And we need to price carbon closer to 80 and maybe even 100 if we want to catalyze some of that change I was talking about. But before we start chasing the attendees at COP26 to price carbon, that first 40%, that's just criminal, right? Like the fact that companies can today take 40% of emissions out based on existing technologies in a way that is ROI positive, I think that is, frankly, a collective gaffe that we are going to look back in history and be vilified for letting this happen under our watch. So I think that first 40%, we need to get up today, go after it. There's no excuse not to pursue it, and the rest of it, we need a lot more policy intervention around carbon pricing, catalytic finance, elimination of subsidies for carbon, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vinay. We were just discussing whether we should have a long question for you or just sort of agree with you. All I can say is that I've had even a representative of German heavy industry sitting next to me on a panel saying, yes, we need a carbon price of 150 euros in order to make it work. But then we also need the level playing field. And there again, it's a question of having, political agreements and also not just 6 countries and the beginning of a carbon price in Europe. Loved your presentation. Thank you very much. Don't run off just in case we have a question later on. Right now, I would like to invite a fellow Canadian who happens to be in Milano for the Foundation 20 Climate Forum right now. And Lourie, don't be shy. Come to my side. Lourie is the president of the Ivey Foundation, so finally we have a proper foundation here on board. Chair, and here it comes, of the Transition Accelerator, senior fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Finance, on and on and on. I'm not going to do the same thing as before, simply because you are here. And the one overruling question that we actually have here is, what are the first 2-3 steps that we need to take now? Not looking back at what mistakes we've made in the past, but what do we need to do now? What are you doing in Canada?
Great, thanks so much, Connie. Is this? Yeah, you can
it should be working.
Great, and thanks also to Klaus and Stefan for having me here. It's wonderful to be part of F20. It's, I think, such an important initiative, and I'm going to touch on a couple of things that relate to, certainly to your question, also to the role of philanthropy, and I think, we all like to think that all philanthropy is always great, but, I think philanthropy can always do a better job. So I think we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking through how we approach philanthropy. And in particular, I took note of the 2 of the mottos of F20, one for today, which is putting words into deeds, and the other one, which is leave no one behind. And I think just transition is an important overlay for all of what we're doing. To answer your question of, what we can do right now, and I think what I found, having been working on climate issues for 30 years now, for several decades, or a couple of decades, we were really focused on the why of climate change. We know it's going to cause great devastation around the world. We're starting to see evidence of that today. And a lot of great books were written on why we need to do something about climate change. And then more recently, we started to get into the what of the what of climate change. So what are the things that we need to do? There's some good books out right now on what we need to do. Bill Gates's book actually is, I think, quite a interesting, well-written, simple description of that. What I find that we're missing is the how. How do we do this? So we've heard many people talk about, we need justice, we need equity, we need support of indigenous people, we need, I was very interested in the agriculture and farm conversation this morning. I wanted to jump up and get into that conversation. I love that issue. But the how is actually much more complicated than the what. And I think in philanthropy, there's been a lot of focus on the why, a lot of focus on the problems, a lot of focus on what we need to do, and not nearly enough focus on how do we actually do it. How do we build support for the ideas that we're trying to get across to people? How do we get mainstream support? So the Ivey Foundation has really shifted in the last 10 years from being much more of a traditional funder of environmental activism and environmental work to trying to understand how do we build mainstream support for the energy transition. And that's really our exclusive focus today. And just for me, on the simple question of what we need to do is we need to essentially electrify, or we need to stop the use of fossil fuel in all uses, essentially, or virtually all uses. So if that's the premise, stop fossil fuel use, how do you go about doing that? One way of doing it is you need to electrify probably most of end uses. Let's say 80% of all end uses need to be electrified. So how do we go about doing that? We need massive investment in electricity grids, grid modernization, and that's not just the technology, but the governance of grids, how grids are integrated and connected across countries. So that's critically important. We need to, of course, decarbonize all of the electricity that's going into those grids. And then finally, all end uses probably need to be twice as efficient as they are today. So we need to double efficiency. We probably need to double all of the electricity grid infrastructure in the world, and we need to decarbonize all electricity inputs. Though just in that one area, that one system, our energy system, that is massive, it's complex, it's trillions and trillions of dollars. But what we're seeing in our country and other countries is that it's very difficult to get projects built. People are opposing wind farms. People are opposing gas plants for good reason. People are opposing, nuclear power. People are opposing transmission lines. So we've got a culture of too many people opposing projects and not enough of a culture of people who want to invest, people who are looking at the positive side of this. And this is something that I think often gets missed in conversations about financing. So when we're looking at attracting large amounts of capital and shifting capital from one part of the economy to another, investors need confidence that projects get built in a timely fashion. They need confidence that there's some sort of sound governance structure, there's stability in government, there's certainty in policy. And those are the kinds of things that we've decided to really focus on at the Ivey Foundation. So we've set about to kind of rebuild much of the institutional capacity in Canada to focus on these things. And one of the first things that we did, in fact, in our program starting 7 years ago was to focus on carbon pricing. And so I'm happy to say now that Canada has a national carbon price. Every single province, some provinces took it to the Supreme Court and lost. So we've got stable, I would say, quite stable support for carbon pricing going forward, and a plan to increase it to $170 a ton, Canadian dollars, so 130 US dollars a ton. So that's significant. That starts getting us into the range that everyone is describing that will attract the kind of investments for clean economy. One of the super tough sectors is agriculture. I was really interested in hearing the conversation this morning. There are many reasons why agriculture is important. Of course, it's a huge consumer of energy and emitter of climate emissions. But also the agriculture sector historically, at least in our country, has not been active in the climate conversation. And if anything, typically they're opposing conversations around climate or opposing, carbon pricing, opposing, in many cases, governments that are trying to do things on climate. So we actually, a couple of years ago, built a coalition of farm groups across the country. And for the first time, we now have support from the federal government to do a number of things, working with the farm sector to deal with climate change. But again, this was, and I guess one of my messages, which gets back to the idea of building mainstream support and being positive, is working with the people who have a vested interest in that issue. So this was literally farm groups across the country, tens of thousands of farmers supporting policy for climate change. And for years, we couldn't break through in Canada on that, but we now have our federal government putting several $100 million into climate supportive farm policy. So we're very excited about that. We also built something called an Institute for Sustainable Finance. So we have 20 business schools across the country that are now doing research on sustainable finance. We have all 5 of our major banks supporting it. And again, this is, there's a lot of work to do. In fact, the one area that I'm still quite disappointed with our government is on sustainable finance. But we are actually seeing, I think, increasing interest and increasing support. But that's going to be a slow, long slog, I think, in our country. The one challenge, again, that we still have is we've got still an active oil industry. And I think as long as Americans are driving cars and using all of our oil and gas, we will still be shipping our oil and gas to the United States, much to the dismay of people like Michael that I can see on my screen here. I think with that, I'm going to maybe close off. And, oh, no, just mention one final thing, which actually relates to the just transition piece. We recognized that a big part of just transition is how do you build the economic activity and then train people for the future economy? And very little of that was being done in our country. So we now have a coalition of community colleges doing training on everything from electric vehicles to hydrogen to building retrofits, and again have a significant new government program that we're anticipating will be supporting these community colleges to do the skills development, skills training. And that's a role I think philanthropy can play in really helping to convene those kinds of educational entities to help support the transition piece. So I think with that, I will leave it, Connie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I wish we had the time to actually go into depth because, of course, in the transition and to get the buy-in of the people, you have to have it just. And, of course, countries like Germany, countries like Canada are tackling with that question. We can't because a lady is actually sitting on the proverbial hot coals. In other words, she needs to get away. And, Bruce, you're going to be around maybe for another question afterwards. The lady that's about to run away is Angela Churie Kallhauge, or Kallhauge. Please correct me if you can. And she is the head of Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition at the World Bank. Up to now, we've been talking about the IMF. We mustn't forget about the steering role of the World Bank that actually started to think about green bonds, for example, like 14 years ago. Now, Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and Angela, I know that you need to run off, so please take it away now. What exactly are you doing there, and how can we ascertain leadership in carbon pricing?
Thank you very much, and apologies that I was an optimist today, packing my day with a number of things and not realizing that this was going to be an enormously interesting session, which to my sadness, I will have to miss part of it. So thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Angela Churie Kallhauge, and I lead the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition Secretariat at the World Bank. As many of the previous speakers have indicated so far, the attention to climate change has grown significantly in the last years, and there's no doubt anymore that we need to act urgently if we're to avoid catastrophic climate change. This is, of course, highly evident from some of the recent extreme events that we have seen, not only the fires in North America, the floods across the world, and some of the devastating hurricanes. So time is no longer on our side. To get to the objective of the Paris Agreement, we will, of course, have to do everything we can. And this means reducing our emissions in the order of 50 to 55% by 2030, compared to 2010 levels. And further taking these reductions beyond 2050 by balancing any residual emissions with removals. So getting to zero, as has been raised also by some of the other speakers, will require significant investments. We have heard of figures of the order of 1 to 2 trillion per year. That's, for example, from the Energy Transition Commission a few years ago. And much of this will be going to the energy sector, but of course the costs will vary from region to region. Now, I work for a coalition that focuses on carbon pricing. I'm really excited that carbon pricing now comes up almost in all conversations on climate change, not least with regards to how do we mobilize investment, how do we incentivize technology, innovation and deployment, how do we enable more engagement of stakeholders, how do we get the private sector up in the leadership wheel. So I think it is a really important area not to lose sight of, also recognizing that we still have a lot to do. I think Kayo in his remarks earlier mentioned that there's still space for improvement. And now in the conversations around net zero, the role of carbon pricing then becomes very pertinent. So to fully understand that, we convened a task force with a broad representation from government, industry, civil society, academia, to try and unpack the issues around net zero. What do we mean? And what do we need to do to get there? What are the means, both in terms of investment, institutions, etc. And how does carbon pricing play a role? And how do we maximize the potential? As we know right now, there is a lot of momentum when it comes to setting net zero targets and commitments around the world. I think right now we're about 63 countries And under the leadership of the Race to Zero campaign, we're seeing a number of subnational regions, over 700 cities and over 300 businesses stepping forward with their own. And all this is great. However, there's still a lot of questions around how these announcements are going to translate into real and credible actions. How do they align so that we can achieve that global net zero target and put us all on the path to addressing climate change? So what we did in this task force, and we released a report last week, by the way, was we first started trying to see whether we could agree on what do we mean by global net zero. And I hear it's important to also recognize a difference between when an entity says they are net zero and when we talk about global net zero, which is the endpoint that we would like to collectively get to. And for this to happen, we will need emissions to be reduced to the absolute minimum levels feasible. And I put emphasis also on feasible because it's not just about reducing them, it's harnessing everything, both from technologies to investments to institutions, to actually get there. And remaining residual emissions will need to be balanced by an equivalent quantity of human-caused removals that are permanently stored so that they cannot be released into the atmosphere. That means a lot. It means that all countries will need to participate in this. They will all need to do as much to reduce emissions as quickly as possible. And not only where emission reductions are least cost, but we also need to recognize that countries are going to be moving at different paces. So what a developed, rich economy could do may not necessarily be what a less developed emerging economy with other challenges would be able to do. However, all should be able to contribute from the perspective of the social and economic situations. So we concluded that these strategies will need to be developed for the local context and need to be embedded in the context of sustainable development, which means that when we talk about net zero, when we talk about any of the policies in that context, they must balance multiple policy goals from economic growth, jobs, access to energy, poverty, protection of vulnerable communities, remembering that people need to be at the center of the solutions for them to be sustainable, and ecosystem, economic, and environmental resilience. For high emitting countries or those entities that are going to be claiming net zero, we are calling for them to prioritize emission reductions first and foremost, and then of course, enhancing removals where possible, and to make sure that they consider short and medium term targets. Because when we talk about 2050, some of us may not be here for 2050, but having short and medium targets by which we can assess progress, identify and prioritize technologies and investments will enable us to then do this with a lot more credibility. So as John Kerry said earlier today, we need to harness all the tools we have at our disposal. And this is where looking at carbon pricing policies and measures is particularly important, as not only as a vehicle to drive investment, but also to give the right incentives and send the right signals to the broader decarbonization agenda. So we know from our previous work that carbon pricing, as part of a broader policy context and in support of multiple social, economic, and development objectives, is very powerful. It can incentivize global and sectoral transformations, spur innovation, and in so doing, not only decarbonize the economy, but also promote economic growth. So it is an important tool and we should not lose sight of it. But having said that, and I think this came through very clearly in the earlier panelists, a lot more needs to be done. So last year, carbon pricing instruments generated about 53 billion in revenue, and that's an increase of 8 billion from the previous year. And from modeling studies that we have done together with colleagues at IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, and the University of Maryland, we find that if we end up with a well-functioning Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, we can save up to 250 billion per year. So there is potential. But having said that, the carbon pricing instruments we have globally only cover 21% of global emissions. That's less than a quarter, and less than 4% of this are at levels commensurate with what is recommended to deliver on Paris. That's levels of $50 to $100 by 2030. I think Vinay made that very clear in his intervention. So we need carbon prices that are high enough to ensure that they provide effective signals to society, to drive the level of investment and technological changes necessary to reach net zero. And they need to be taken in conjunction with complementary actions to make carbon pricing relevant across company value chains and of course across all relevant sectors in our economies. We can achieve this by expanding these mechanisms, by enhancing coordination across countries to cover a higher proportion of global emissions, and of course, putting in place robust and effective markets under the Paris Agreement. I think it's one of the big issues that will be discussed in Glasgow. Now, we know there's been a lot of conversation around the international carbon market, in particular questions around the voluntary market. And we do recognize that for such markets to deliver on their full potential, they must not only serve to increase ambition and leverage investment, and this should be done not only on the basis of reducing costs, but should capitalize on the power of cooperation across regions and between the public and the private sector. So a good opportunity to harness all stakeholders into this common, should I say, a target that we're all working towards. But they need to be credible, and they need to gain and maintain public acceptance. And for this to happen, they need to operate within that clear trajectory to net zero. So there has to be that clear reference between what we're doing in the market and how it helps us get to where we want to go. We're going to need very clear and robust accounting rules to ensure that we're not doing double counting. And they need to be designed with the relevant guardrails and safeguards that will not only promote equity, inclusion, and this includes inclusive engagement of counterparts in developing countries, as well as to also ensure that we reduce the risk of non-permanence where removals are being, should I say, promoted through the markets. Now, in the absence of formal regulations at the national level, I mean, since what we already have on carbon pricing is a good start, but it's still not enough. And in the absence of pricing signals from governments or guidance on the international markets under Paris, the use of internal carbon pricing can be particularly important for companies and other entities that are seeking to make decisions about emission reduction strategies and investments to achieve their targets along the net zero trajectory. Equally important is the role, of course, of development finance institutions who really need to take net zero, or the thinking around net zero, as a central principle of their portfolios, where they could integrate relevant criteria in all the investment decisions to support rapid decarbonization and taking of course into account the national circumstances of individual countries. So in this case as well, the use of internal carbon pricing, whether it's a shadow price within the budget planning or other, at a price level that would align their investments with these trajectories, could be used for scenario analysis, to assess risks, and of course to open up for opportunities for investment decisions. So to conclude, making this transition to achieve global net zero by mid-century, we have to maximize on the use of all instruments at our disposal. We need to harness the opportunities at hand to work together, including, of course, through using the market and market-based instruments. And as such, carbon pricing, whether we're talking about the regulations, the market, or even the use of internal carbon pricing for planning purposes, should be considered a key part of the policy mix and an arsenal of measures that will enable us to mobilize investment at scale and incentivize further technological development. And most importantly, we need to do this together. And this is definitely one of the areas we in the World Bank are focusing on how we can strengthen and empower the participation also of economies in the global South to be part of the discourse in setting the rules so that they can equally participate in using market carbon pricing instruments as part of their climate change strategies. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Angela, we are sorry that we have taken a longer time and therefore put a stress on you. Thank you very much for sharing your views. Had we more time, I would ask you about the appropriate level of carbon pricing, but I know that you've got to run. So you're exempt from answering that question, and we stay on the American continent for our next speaker, our next contributor. Michael Northrop is with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and And we had heard Bruce earlier saying that the role of foundations and the role of philanthropy is limited but effective. So, Michael, with your background as having worked at Ashoka, with your background as serving on New York City Sustainability Advisory Board and on the city's Waterfront Advisory Board, and of course for New York that's quite critical because the water levels are going to rise. What is your take on how to shift the money that we need?
Great, thanks. I am unmuted, amazing. That never happens. Thank you, Connie, and thanks to Stefan and to Klaus for pulling off this remarkable agenda. I'm sorry I'm not there in Milan with you to enjoy that wonderful city and to be with you all. I'm going to be a little provocative. Maybe that's a way of keeping people awake in the last 5 minutes of this session. But first off, I'm at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. We are a foundation that's based on the profits made in the oil industry. Now, 70 years after our founding, we're about 50% of our grant making is all related to climate change. And we've also decided to fully divest our endowment. I think our endowment's about $1.5 billion. So not that big, but we have committed to fully divesting it from fossil fuels. We're almost all the way there now. We've outperformed all the benchmarks doing so. So definitely have not felt that this has been a stress economically for us. In fact, we benefited. We are thinking a lot about what the next big things are we need to do. And the thing that is the top of my list right now is we are really concerned about the flow of private capital with fossil fuel development. If you look at the 2021 Banking on Climate Chaos report, you can Google that, put out by BankTrack, the Rainforest Action Network, and a bunch of other groups. They calculate that private banks, 60 of the largest banks on the planet, have invested or lent $3.8 trillion to fossil fuel development since the Paris Agreement was agreed to. It's about $750 billion a year. And the trend line is increasing when it needs to be ending. The IEA said no more oil and gas can be developed if we're going to keep warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yet the amount of investment in fossil fuels is going up. You just repeat that. The IEA said no more investment in oil and gas if we're going to keep to 1.5 degrees, and yet the amount is rising. The four largest financiers of fossil fuels happen to be American banks: JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citibank, Bank of America. Super depressing. About $1 trillion of that 3.8 is those four banks. When asked, a senior official at JP Morgan Chase told me this year, this is a government problem. JP Morgan Chase can't solve climate change. Government has to solve climate change. You know, actually, JP Morgan Chase could make a meaningful dent in de-stressing the atmosphere, but it chooses not to. There's too much money to make by financing fossil fuel development. It's one of their biggest profit centers. Banks, investors, and oil companies are not signatories to the Paris Agreement. They stand outside, pursuing business as usual, while the earth heats up, literally burns up, as we've been watching over the last year or two. I just keep thinking they don't have kids or grandkids to worry about. Personally, just a personal comment, I find it incomprehensible that these bankers are operating against the interests of themselves, their families, presumably, and the rest of us. So that's the bad news, and it is really bad news. And we need to be thinking about it. But there is some good news. You know, the divestment movement is growing like crazy. When we announced our divestment commitment in 2014, we were with $54 billion of managed assets that were agreeing to do that. It was a couple hundred divestors. Now in 2021, there are thousands of institutions that committed to divesting. And we know publicly, there are $15 trillion in managed assets that have agreed to divest from fossil fuels. Not all of them are there yet, but they're working on it. Most of them are divesting from coal and tar sands, and many are beginning the move towards oil and gas too. We also see many public finance institutions like the Ivey, the Bank of England, the New York Common Pension Fund, the World Bank, and China, have all made very substantial commitments to divest from coal finance and fossil fuel finance. This is a big deal. It's really important. EIB last year, China last week, the really big announcements, really important. We also see lots of banks and investors making meaningful, positive commitments to invest in clean energy solutions. That's fantastic. There's trillions you can count now, and that's what banks lead from. But the horrifying reality is that 60 private banks continue to finance fossil fuel development to the tune of about $750 billion a year. That's the key fact we really need to think about. It's insane. We're in a desperate moment. Just look at last summer and last year: fire, storms, sea level rise, storm surge, people dying. We are just hearing in the last couple of weeks that the ocean current that keeps Europe warm is slowing down, maybe stopping, that there's a big blob of hot water sort of stuck in the North Atlantic that isn't making it to Europe now because that conveyor belt has started to stall. We know that in 300 years and current projections go forward that 80% of global cities will be in a different place because they're all going to have to move because they're all near coastlines. So what do we do about this really problematic, dirty finance problem? There's several streams of work all converging now, which is good news. The divestment movement is picking up. Even if it's only signaling, it's really important. It also means more capital is being allocated for other things. I think the Harvard announcement last week was a really big deal, or 2 weeks ago. Insurers, public governments are all moving. Again, China and the EIB, really important. The Bank of England and Mark Carney and Mike Bloomberg are working hard on mandatory disclosure, really important, good steps. There's a alphabet soup of climate working groups that banks are a part of: UNEP, PRI, PCAP, PACTA, Center for Climate Aligned Finance, Net Zero Asset Alliance, SBTI, and others. I think these things are all great. Lots of smart people working on big problems. But I do worry that there's a huge amount of inertia in that system, and there still aren't real deadlines for actual divestment from fossil fuel investment. We have an even bigger problem in the private investor space, which I won't talk about, but all this passive investment at BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard going in the wrong direction or not being able to do anything they say is a serious problem. We're also starting to see some discussion from, I think this is important, from financial regulators in the US and in Europe. In the US, we see the Federal Reserve, the Treasury, the SEC, the Commodity Future Trading Commission, insurance regulators, and many others. We have a big army of finance regulators in the US all talking about this finally. But it's also being massively challenged in DC by the fossil fuel companies, by the banks who say that this is a government problem, and one of our political parties. If regulatory action starts, you can be sure lawsuits will result, and it'll slow action. It's going to be a slow process. And there seems to be a similar kind of dynamic in Europe going forward. It's hard for 27 nations to reach consensus. So it's not all going to happen quickly. It was great to see Spain take bold action to mandate climate action plans by banks. This is Mark Carney's approach. He wants everybody in the financial sector to start putting plans out, hopefully in advance of Glasgow. That's a good thing. We should be encouraging it. I hear hints from other European nations that they're considering taking action, but it does seem to get stalled out by the need to kind of work in the Brussels context, and that may be slowing things down. And maybe the most hopeful thing of all is what's happening in the Fridays for the Future movement and with youth groups who all are beginning to get out and mobilize. They've just announced this fall that there will be civil disobedience all fall in the run-up to Glasgow, blocking bank entrances, publicly shaming big brand banks like JP Morgan Chase, trying to convince their peers not to work for these banks.
Absolutely,
but
Michael.
I'm afraid we don't have a solution, and we aren't close to one yet. It's why I'm particularly panicked by this problem. We've got to fix this. You'd hope banks and investors would do the right thing, but sadly, there's no reason to believe they will. They will string this out as long as they can, as long as we let them. Of all the dimensions of climate change that we could be working on, stopping the flow of capital, especially to new fossil fuel development, is the most urgent and difficult task ahead of us. Please, everyone, think about this, work on it. It's super, super important.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I just see that Kallhauge wants to get in very briefly because we're really running out of time. And this is not a commentary on us against climate change, but it's us against it being 3:15 already.
Well, very quick. I just wanted to ask Michael a question. There is the tool you didn't mention of litigation. And I think from my work with European Climate Foundation, American boards I'm on, the Client Earth organization has also been funded by Rockefeller. And isn't that the way we're working with them in Europe? You can litigate the hell out of some of these investments with increasing chance of success. Just a quick word on that.
No, listen, you're right. It should be on my list. I agree with you. And let's dig in on litigation here. I think it's super powerful. So, and what Engine number 1 did last year with its work on the shareholder resolution for Exxon, another great approach and strategy. We need to try more strategies for sure, because, some of them will work, some of them won't, some of them will take too much time. But we just have no time on this. And it is deeply, deeply alarming to see this amount of capital flowing into fossil fuel development when we know that every extra bit of it from this point forward damages our chances to stay below 1.5 degrees.
As we've heard this morning, Johan Rockström saying this year is the year that is really decisive. Either we make it to 1.5 or we will be above that. Thank you very much, Michael and Kallhauge. Both are still on the line. Don't run away, because if I know Klaus at all, he will want to bring you into the conversation one more time.
Thank you very much. It was really brilliant, and also your two sides of the coin, Michael. I liked it very much, to be very realistic where we are and nevertheless see the positive movements we have, and the litigation arena, as Kallhauge mentioned, is really important. I don't want to say too much and make new issues now, because it was hard stuff for all of us here also in the room, because finance is not so usual to deal with so long. But one positive perhaps direction can be seen in the outcome of the German elections. Kallhauge, perhaps you can refer shortly on this, and perhaps you, Michael, we had some discussions in the past already on that, how important it is what's happening in Germany. I would say there is some greening in the German government and in the future government possible, and I think it's important that it will be a European approach. Do you agree? And some words from your side, Kallhauge, both of us, we know Olaf Scholz very well, the future Chancellor. So there are good connections. What is your word on this? And then please, Michael.
You can say anything you want as long as it's not longer than a minute.
I'm fairly optimistic. Was part of a red-green government myself. I think the fact that these two small parties, which have an electorate that are the young people, who have real future agendas, although how to get there, they have very different tools and philosophies. But for them to now be the ones who can, if they agree, determine basically who will be Chancellor under them is very promising. And I see a chance that they will overcome this market versus regulation, which is nonsense. We need both to reach the targets, and use the fact, actually, that the Grand Coalition has a law now enacted that obligates Germany to be carbon neutral by 2005 with a path even defined year by year on how you compensate. So I think the conditions are good. Many things can go wrong in politics, but I think a red, green, yellow coalition could be after 16 years of almost no action. Yeah, I'm biased because our government did more in 5 years than they did in 16 years way back. I'm fairly optimistic that something good can come out of that. Whether it's enough, we'll see. But Germany is such a key player. We hope it will be.
And with that, Michael, please.
Yeah, Germany's need to phase out from coal faster than the current trajectory is so important, right? And hopefully this new coalition government, when it forms, will be able to get there. I was struck by the draft of the report that Rainer Baki's been working on that is quite impressive about how Germany goes forward and electrifies, gets off coal sooner, moves forward, grows its economy is really the right direction, or certainly a lot of the ingredients of the right direction are in Reiner's plan. So I hope that he's working his magic internally across the political spectrum so that more people get behind that. We can do many of the same things here in the US. We were thinking hard about how to electrify here too. So anyway, and I'm very excited about the election and hope you guys can keep that coalition together and point it in the right direction.
We'll see, because the dice have fallen, but they have to be reinterpreted or interpreted. And with that, we're not going to focus on the German issues as such, because, of course, the world of the F20 is a global world. We've been addressing the global challenges of shifting a lot of money. This afternoon, Klaus, we have seen a number of initiatives that are going in the right direction. Of course, we've had our two eagles, Michael and Kayo, with the word but heavily accentuated. But we actually need to move forward, and we need to get those on board that aren't moving yet, but get the emphasis of the good movements. So in comparison to last year, I've asked you that question at the beginning. Now, after this debate.
Well, I'm very satisfied because two examples, John Kerry and head of the Islamic Development Bank, both finished with the word, please come over with your recommendations and solutions we need. And so to follow this invitation for further dialogue, that's important. That was not so strongly last year. And so we should take use of this. And Michael, Kayo, we will try our very best to use these channels. And I think this new cooperation, transformative cooperation, is absolutely needed.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for having been sort of my sidekick. Not too much chance for it because we're running a little bit late, but also with your Eagles view as the chair of the F20. And ladies and gentlemen, with that, we'd like to wrap up. Thank you very much for your interest. Whenever you are going to watch this on your laptops, there might be already a couple of political decisions might have been resolved. The big issue of actually shifting that much money into the right way to de-invest from brown and go for green is going to be something that's going to accompany us in the next couple of years, but we need the right pathways. Some of them were outlined today. Thank you very much for your interest. Tomorrow morning, for those who are here present at Meet at 9 o'clock, we're going to sort of start again. We're looking at cities. Everybody who's here is invited tonight for the drinks that we are being offered here. For everybody who's watching us, can't come here, not in time, but maybe we will have a green way of transporting everybody soon in the future so that we can all be together and not just in front of screens. Till then, bye-bye, thank you.